This panel examines how veterans have been portrayed on the screen, from classics such as The Best Years of Our Lives, The Deer Hunter, and Coming Home, to recent documentaries like Invisible War, Wartorn, and Korengal, as well as how the medium of film both reflects and shapes society's understanding of war and its aftermath.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving up a very sunny, lovely Sunday afternoon in Southern California to join us. We're joined by a distinguished panel of producers, directors, commentators, critics, and I'll begin just by introducing them before saying a few words and then opening this up to about 45 minutes of conversation before having the audience pose some questions. So Braden Yoder studied screenwriting at the Sydney University of Technology, and then filmmaking and film directing at India's very notable Institute for Cinema and Television. His most recent film, Breakdown, a short film, is and has been showing at various film festivals around the country. And prior to all of that, he served both in Germany and Iraq. Kirby Dick is best known for his film, The Invisible War, which is about rape and sexual harassment in the military, which has been widely discussed in various media and was nominated for an Oscar and has won various awards. He's made various other films having to do with experiences of sexuality, sexual molestation in the church, among politicians and so on. But he's also known for other films, like this film Is Not Yet Rated, about the rating system. And one of my personal favorites is a film called Derrida, which is about the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who was, as most people know, the founder of deconstruction, and who spent a good deal of time actually teaching at UC Irvine for about 20 years. Gene Oppenheimer is a Los Angeles correspondent for American Cinematographer magazine and a film critic for Writer's Block. She, for a good long while, was a film critic on KPCC's Film Week, and has spent, prior to that, several years as a story analyst at the Geffen Film Company. She's also been, for 3 terms, president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. So I think I'll leave it at that in terms of introductions. I just want to begin by giving a little bit of background data. Many of you may know this, but just to sort of set the scenes for the discussion before posing a question for the panel. There are approximately 23 million veterans in the United States. That's about 7% of the total population, maybe double that of the adult population. I mean, it's a fairly extraordinary number when you come to think about it. About 7.5 million of those vets are Vietnam vets. About, the figure I've seen for Iraq and Afghanistan is about 2 million, which strikes me as somewhat low. It's probably higher, somewhat higher than that. And there are about 500,000 veterans who are in some association with Veterans Administration healthcare currently underway as inpatients and outpatients. If you think of California, where the numbers are considerably higher, you think about the role of the military in relation to the state. You can't drive probably 100 miles in any direction in the state without crossing military land somewhere along the way. I mean, you drive to San Diego from LA, and obviously you're driving literally through Camp Pendleton. I surf down there a couple of times a week. I'm surfing on military land, right, or in military water, I mean, as the case may be. And so the military is sewn into our everyday social experience of life. I'm sure every one of us, and maybe every California, has some relation to people who have served in the military in some way or another, whether it's family members, friends, colleagues, people you work with, and the like, right? So there's a sense in which the experience of the military through veterans is integrally sewn into our social fabric. And it's for that reason that we think this set of conversations is so important, and it's wonderful to see such a varied and robust audience here today. So I want to begin just by posing to the panelists the question about the way in which veterans, the notion in a sense of coming home and of being at home, of feeling or not feeling at home after having served in the military, particularly in war experience, is represented in cinema, in visual representation, in photography, perhaps in television, and increasingly somewhat skewed perhaps in digital media, in games and the like, somewhat differently, you might say, than cinema. If we're talking about celluloid experience of veterans, we're going to stretch the notion of celluloid because few films are made in that medium today, right? So we can stretch out the sort of nature of this and speak about the visual representation in social media more generally. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, maybe starting to my extreme left with Braden, just to begin the conversation and to talk a bit about how veterans, the nature of war, the military more generally, are represented in our visual experience.
Well, first I'd like to say how much I enjoy being on this panel and how great it is to be here with so many distinguished people. Back when I was in college, there was this trailer for the film Les Miserables, not the musical one, but the dramatic one with Liam Neeson. Do you guys remember that? And that's kind of how I feel right now. This trailer was really interesting and always stayed with me because it introduced all the actors, and it was Academy Award nominee Liam Neeson, Academy Award winner Jeffrey Rush, Academy Award nominee Uma Thurman, and then Claire Danes. And I kind of feel like poor Claire right now because because I'm not a film historian, and I did just move here last year to get started with my career. But the great value of this panel for me has been able to go back in and look at some of these films, and some of them for the first time, some that I never, I don't know that I would have actually checked out before without this, partly because I thought I lived it, and partly because I didn't want to deal with it. So to your question about how it's been portrayed, and I think you really did hit on something with the celluloid part, because it's not celluloid anymore, it's digital. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because the means of representation have changed so much. And I think when I was looking back at some of these films, I think that really is a cultural thing to sort of discuss, as far as how people are relating now to these films, how people are relating now to the media. Yeah, okay, let me just, maybe someone else could take it from there, and let me.
I'll jump in here. Is that on? Okay. Because I am a little bit surprised how few films there have been over the years that deal with returning vets and the problems that they have. Most war films deal with war, often combat. But the fact that a character has served in a war is often part of the backstory of the character. It's often a part of even the storyline. And I know this will seem like a very odd film to bring up, but Lethal Weapon, which is really a buddy-buddy cop film. But the three main characters, Mel Gibson plays a Vietnam veteran who has had a lot of trouble readjusting. He can't work with anybody. They all consider him suicidal because he takes such risks. The Danny Glover character was a Vietnam veteran, but he has come back and he has made a smooth readjustment. He's married, he has kids. And then the bad guy, Gary Busey, is just the bad guy, but he also happened to have been a Vietnam War veteran. One thing that I find in all of the films, starting with films about the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf Wars, are similarities in two main ways. One of which is that the returning vet feels so isolated that all of these movies, you'll hear lines about, they don't know, they weren't there. The Deer Hunter, which I think is an extraordinary film about Vietnam. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, Gregory Peck, World War II. But all of them are supposed to readjust. They're killing people one day, all of a sudden the next day they're going through the most mundane tasks like going to the grocery store. And they feel isolated, and they all miss not just the comradeship, but also the sense of security that they feel from the people, being around people that they served with. And I do think that that's just a point that we may want to develop a little bit as we talk.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on that notion of isolation. When I made the film The Invisible War, which is about sexual assault in the military, just a little bit about background about me. I haven't served. My father did in World War II. It was never, it was an important part of his life, but it wasn't, and he would tell me stories, but it's certainly not a direct experience I had. So this is the first opportunity I had to make a film with veterans. And one of the things we did very early on is, along with my producer, Amy Ziering, we actually went across country for a couple of weeks. And, one of the first challenges in making this film was to find these survivors of sexual assault, because at that time, people were very unwilling to come forward. There was a great amount of shame, a great amount of disbelief, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to make the film. So after months and months of kind of searching down and finding these people, we sort of set out an itinerary across the film. And that's one of the things, when we'd go into these homes, and these people oftentimes would be telling their stories to us for the first time, sometimes stories that they never even, in one case, and in several cases, they hadn't told anyone else at all. And you realized how isolated they were, and how that they had served, they'd had this incredible experience. It's negative and positive. This is one of the things that also struck me is that they'd come back with so many skills and so many assets, and yet this had more to do with the fact that they were sexually assaulted, and the trauma and the PTSD that came from that. But they were isolated, and they were sort of separated from the world that I knew. And to go back to this isolation, I think we have a country here where people who have served and have family members who've served and understand that, and another part of the country that doesn't. And that divide, I think, is really tragic for our country, because I think it doesn't. I think there's this feeling like, well, these people are going to go out and fight this war, and they're going to deal with the consequences of that, and the rest of society doesn't have to. And so I was really, really struck by how we as a nation had let down these people who had served for us. And I think it's ongoing, and I think it's, you look at the VA, this is one of the things that we saw over and over and over, is just, there are good people in the VA, certainly in the medical side, there's no question, but they are overwhelmed and underfunded. So, I think it's, in that regard, I'm really not talking about representation, but it came out of making this film. I really think it's tragic in this country, and we have, this is something that our country, I think, should really turn to and deal with.
So I just want to pose a counter for the moment. When we point to the challenges and the difficulties, we often overlook the kind of Danny Glover figure, who's the well-adjusted sort of returnee. And there are lots and lots of well-adjusted people who return and having had challenging experiences, life-transforming experiences, as Kirby has put it. And going to war, no doubt, will be life-transforming for probably anybody who does. And yet, many people do come back, and so we don't want to sort of misidentify the whole population of veterans as coming back and not adjusting to society on the one hand. On the other hand, what you are pointing to, and perhaps Braden, speaking from his own personal experience, can speak to some of this. There's a question of the social invisibility of war. In a society like ours, right? We're distanced from it. Most, if not all, wars in this country have been fought elsewhere, perhaps but for the Civil War. And that distance, in a way, hides the experience of war, at least intimately, from the population, very often overlooking and turning away from and not having to deal with other than funding moments or moments of trauma to the country, and so on, the blowing up of the base in Beirut in 1982, and so on and so forth, right? So there's this question of how well, obviously movies look to more audacious experiences, right, which tend to be the experiences of maladjustment, perhaps, right? And I want to ask Braden to begin by speaking from his own experience about whether that's a full representation of the experience of the veteran.
Which ones in particular?
The question of both invisibility, the invisibility of war to the society at large on the one hand, and the question of the experience of the veteran in negotiating social circumstances upon return.
Sure, I'd be happy to speak personally about that. So I remember coming home and not being able to have conversations with people whom I had known my whole life. And I think most of us who did go to war probably experienced something very similar to that. And being irritated by friends not being able to ask me questions about it, and not wanting to ask me questions about it. And I don't want to speculate as to why they didn't, and maybe that's something for the rest of the panel. But I remember being very upset, thinking that I had something to say about this experience that I had gone through, but people didn't know how to ask me about it. And of course, over the years, I mellowed out about that kind of anger. But as far as feeling invisible, I still remember, I know this girl since I was 7 years old, and I've known her husband since I was 12, and we all went out for breakfast one day, and not a single question about the war. Instead, we talked about their lives, their kids, I had missed their marriage, things like that. And I know they weren't meaning to be insensitive, but I remember being very upset about it and thinking that, where do I go for that? And that's what I went to writing school for, actually. That's really, I worked out a lot of my issues through going through a creative writing program and being able to talk to myself and kind of figure it out. I don't know how other veterans do it. The Wounded Warriors Battalion, and there's a lot of different, the Soldiers Project, there's a lot of different things out there now where people can go and talk. But I think all of us who come back do feel that we have something worth sharing, and we'd like to be asked. That was in the, what was it, Gene, the Operation Homecoming? There was a part in that Operation Homecoming documentary where somebody says every veteran, no matter how high their rank or how low their rank, has something worth saying, and I think I would agree with that.
That's really a wonderful documentary called Operation Homecoming, writing about the war experience. And a number of veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are profiled, interviewed. It's so moving. You'll find yourself crying during parts of it. And that writing has, as for Braden, become an outlet for a lot of them. I think that there's a special stigma attached to the Vietnam War in a lot of people's minds, and by extension, the veterans who served there. The people who opposed the war were angry at them. The people who supported the war were angry at them for losing. And and they were not treated well when they came home. And I think it's interesting, and I don't really understand why, so I guess I'm sort of asking, that the soldiers coming home from the Gulf Wars have been treated differently. People may be opposed to the war or support the war, but they don't seem to blame the soldiers in the same way. Now, I don't know, Braden, if that's been your experience or not.
Well, in thinking about that before this panel, I was thinking that the reason we've been treated, I guess, better, at least in the popular imagination, whether it's with the yellow ribbons or decals or things that people put on their cars, or some of these "Let's Help the Troops" kind of programs, and I think the reason would be because most people aren't affected by it and they don't have to think about it on a day-to-day basis, whereas in the Vietnam era, everybody knew somebody who was affected personally by the war, whether their brother was drafted or they were drafted, or they had to find some way to avoid it, and it was much more systemic across the culture. The other thing I would say, and this is what I was trying to get at, I guess, with representation, is things have changed so much as far as how we experience these things. I mean, back in the days when you had 3 television networks, you had no choice but to look at it on the news, right? I mean, nowadays, the networks still give the president time for the State of the Union, right? But if you don't want to watch the State of the Union, you're going to change the channel to one of another 2,000 different channels that are out there for you. But in the old days, I mean, you think about Vietnam, I'll go back to Vietnam, you think about how many images those of us who have studied history still have in our head about Vietnam. There's the one about the South Vietnamese officer about to execute the guy that he expects being a Viet Cong informant. We've got the one about the children running down the street from napalm. Having hit their village. We have the one about the Buddhist monk self-immolating, right? These images stay with us, and I think everybody had to confront them and deal with them back in the old days when the media was much less sort of diverse. And nowadays, it's not, right? And I think maybe as a culture, we don't want to necessarily think about hard things. Those of us who served were on the military channel. Okay, great. We'll look at it for a couple minutes, and then we'll change the channel.
Yeah, I also, in terms of that, I mean, it was, I think the control of the media in these recent wars plays a big role in that. I mean, I made a very early film. I was working on a short film. We required some B-roll of Vietnam-era, combat footage, and I was just going in and just seeing all that footage and how reporters and filmmakers would have that kind of access was just shocking. When we were, I think it was shortly after the first Gulf War, and just and we although there wasn't that much combat there certainly was much more, and we've seen so few images, which is why what was the film that was made about that unit that was
Restrepo?
Yeah, Restrepo. I mean, that was what was so stunning about that is you see this, and you see, I've been following this war for years, and I haven't seen that footage, and I think that's unfortunate.
Well, there's that. There's also, of course, I mean, everybody knows that we don't see the images of the coffins coming home draped in flags, and that was a Bush-era decision. I don't know if the Obama administration is still doing it, but I haven't seen those images either. I guess the other question I would have is how many people would actually look at those images, though, if they were available. I do wonder if, I mean, we've got a really good turnout here, and I want to thank everybody for coming out, but, there's still some empty seats. We could have had more people if people wanted to be confronted with this sort of thing or come out for this sort of thing, but how many of us want to actually, look away from the smartphone or look away from the tablet and actually think about things like this? I think it's a real question for the culture, because I think things have gotten a little too easy, perhaps. And to relate this to cinema, I had never seen The Deer Hunter, I think because it was 3 hours long and I had avoided it in film school. But I went and watched it, obviously, on the way up to here. And what I was struck by was the idea that I had to deal with a very slow-moving film and actually have to think about it. And you couldn't tell that story today, I think, in the same way. You'd have to do it in a much quicker way, in a much different style, rather than actually trying to think, what is the maker of the film trying to get at here? And I think maybe the fetish or the obsession has moved away from trying to understand the maker to how does it relate to me. So the fetish is now with the recipient rather than with the actual filmmaker, if that makes sense.
not to shift the conversation too much, I'm wondering about whether there are quite deep gender differentiations in the representation of veterans, if women indeed get represented at all. I mean, most representations about war and the military tend to be about men. If you don't have family or people you're close to who are in the military, if I asked you to close your eyes and imagine a scene about war or a military veteran, I'd wage maybe not my bottom dollar, but close to it, that image is going to be of a man, right? So I wonder, what about the sorts of gender representation? I mean, your film notwithstanding.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's the majority of soldiers and veterans are men, right. And so that's only changed quite recently. And there have been a few Iraq War feature films, not that anybody saw them, but that focus on the woman's experience, or one, Grace is Gone, in which John Cusack's wife is killed overseas, and he takes his kids away on a vacation to try to get up the nerve to tell them that their mother has died. There's another one called The Lucky One, in which Rachel McAdams and Tim Robbins and Michael Pena end up on a road trip together. So there is a representation, somewhat, but they even in the documentaries that I see about Iraq, there are certainly fewer, if any, women that are dealt with. Kirby may feel differently about that because certainly his film focuses predominantly on women.
Yes, and there was an excellent film called Lioness, which actually served and dealt with this issue of women who were, I guess, not getting benefit. Actually, were in combat, but not getting benefits because they weren't allowed to be in particular kinds of combat, and it was a very interesting documentary. One of the things, early on, again, when I was researching this film, we talked to many people who were interacting with women veterans, and one of the things that struck me is a couple of them said that sometimes these women didn't even consider themselves veterans, even though they'd served. They didn't consider themselves that, and they had to, be told, yes, no, you're a veteran, just because I think the culture itself didn't treat people coming, these women coming back as veterans, yeah, I mean, I think that that is starting to change, and I think you're certainly seeing it in the culture and in politics. I mean, I think people are much more careful, politicians, and to speak about men and women than they were 10, 15 years ago. And I actually think that again, it's not dealing with representation, but the fact that women are able to serve, I think is going a long way toward pushing equality of men and women forward in this country, because that's one of the things that the military can do and has done very, very well. I mean, this film was about sexual assault in the military, and obviously, women were being assaulted, although women would be assaulted at a higher percentage, but more, because there were so many men in the military, there in absolute numbers, more men were actually being assaulted. But if the military takes this on, they can do it. One of the things we saw that they did with racism is they really led the way, and they had the military, like the rest of this country, had a huge problem with racism, and they over a 10-year period in the 70s, they really set out to address that, and they did very successfully. So racism is much less in the military than in the society. So I think, obviously the military can and has been a leader in a lot of these things, and hopefully the representation in this case will follow.
I noticed that in some films, most of these feature films were made, say, after the Second World War, and the best film I think ever made about returning war vets and readjusting to life is The Best Years of Our Lives. If you've never seen it, it's just phenomenal. Won 6 or 7 Academy Awards, very well deserved, made in 1946 by William Wyler, who had in fact served. But often, women have changed during the war, and it's reflected in sometimes the minor difficulties the men have when they come back from war because their wives have become more independent. They had to go to work. So they're relegated more to that position. But in some films like The Men, Fred Zinnemann, Marlon Brando's first film, he comes back a paraplegic, and they've been engaged, and he does everything he can to push her away. And it's a very interesting treatment, I think, because at first she is very much trying to say, you can't push me away, I am here for the long haul. And then at a certain point she begins to wonder, what am I getting myself into? And I thought that was very advanced for the time period before, well, I don't want to give away the ending, but it ends happily.
Just a point of information, there was a very interesting interview this morning on public radio with an author, a woman author, who has just written a book that is appearing on, I think it's called Girl Soldiers or Girl Warriors, following 3 women who've just served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And following their lives both in being away and in returning, and the challenges and difficulties they face, which are both general in relation to veterans and peculiar to women, especially. So it might be worthwhile for those of you interested, and no doubt the basis of a future film.
Films.
Oh, films, yes, indeed. So
David, before we move on, could I just say something about Kirby's film, which I really enjoyed? And my first unit in the military was all male, and then I transferred to a supply unit for my last 2 years. So I was on the so my battlefield in Iraq was leading supply convoys, but I had never considered the issues that you brought up with your film. And I know you've made a huge difference with the Department of Defense, and Leon Panetta saw your film and made some changes, but it was really striking to me how I had been in this co-ed unit with female officers and female soldiers, all of whom wanted to serve for the same reasons that I did, and yet it never occurred to me that the systems that we had in place for sexual assault, just go up the chain, trust the chain of command, it never occurred to me that might fail female soldiers somewhere along the line. It just wasn't something that ever occurred to me. So I was really happy to see your film, and great job, man.
Thank you.
So to come back to this question of social invisibility and visibility, I mean, how do you think that films have or can make a difference in bringing to life the conditions and relationships evolved in return?
Well, I think that a lot of what people think about a number of subjects, but about war, how they form an opinion, often does come from films. And so, of course, you still have to get people into the movie theaters, and that can be a problem, either because it's a 3-hour film, or some of these marvelous documentaries. It's difficult to get people into the theater to see documentaries, which is why I think it's great when they're played on television, whether it's HBO or PBS or any of these. It's a way to reach more people. But films do serve as a major influence. They have not been, certainly the ones about the Iraq War, the feature films did not do particularly well. The Hurt Locker did, although a lot of veterans themselves were very opposed to the film.
Disgusted.
Thank you. Disgusted with the film.
Yeah, it's interesting with The Hurt Locker because you look on Rotten Tomatoes, it has like a 97% fresh rating. I mean, the critics loved it, and obviously it won all these Oscars. And while some veterans did enjoy it, there's a huge thing in the Wikipedia page, veteran response, and it's very, very critical. And for me, it broke down with this interview with Ann Hornaday, the Washington Post film critic, and Paul Rykhoff, who's the founder of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And Rykhoff really didn't like it, and Hornaday did. And for what Hornaday was really pushing was the idea of this emotional truth that, yeah, okay, there were things that were fictionalized, and obviously, there's a lot of hurry up and wait in the military, so you have to kind of condense things. But she felt it got to something emotional. Now, where that emotion comes from for her, I don't know if that's an idea of what she thinks it must be like, but somehow it got to her, and I thought that was pretty, common across the board with the reviews I read about the Hurt Locker, whereas the veteran response was much more critical about how fabricated so many of these situations where you don't have an EOD team, a three-man EOD team, go off into the green zone and separate one by one going after some insurgents. You don't have an EOD ranger who all of a sudden is also a sniper qualified and can take out these insurgents or these terrorists or whatever you want to call them from a mile away. And for me, what it came down to really, and again, to get back to representation, is when you look at the Hurt Locker, it's presented in this sort of docudrama style, which I think is kind of been, and maybe Kirby might want to speak to this too, but it's been sort of the trend of the last sort of 10, 15 years. You look at the films of a guy like A Mighty Heart, what's his name? The British guy. Michael Winterbottom. And he did The Road to Guantanamo, and you have this docudrama style that's presenting events, but almost as if you're there, almost as if, as I said, the recipient is interacting with the text as if we're there. And for veterans who actually were there, that can be really quite jarring, and I think that's a great film to look at. You have this hugely successful critical response, and you have a very, very divisive response on the veteran side. And I think it's because of the means of representation. Whereas you look at something like Restrepo, again, documentary, but that's real. And when we were having our conference call a couple weeks ago, Jean made the comment that for her, the documentaries were much more powerful than any of the sort of fictional feature films about Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, Hurt Locker is interesting. I think there's a tendency in Hollywood to try to, find one character to carry everything, and I mean that's really the opposite of the way the military works. If there is, an institution that focuses on teamwork, it's the military. So I think in that regard, it's a complete misrepresentation. And I personally had a huge problem with that because I actually would have, obviously having no experience with that whatsoever, I would have loved to have seen everything that went around that. And I think a lot of drama could have come out of that. But I think there is a simplistic approach that Hollywood takes, which is to focus things into an individual. And it's interesting because you brought up this idea of the maladjusted veteran, when in fact, statistics show that veterans are less likely to be maladjusted. They're more likely to be more successful, make more money, so I think Hollywood is kind of responsible for this, and I think in some ways there's a reason because. We all, this country looks at veterans with a great deal of respect, and they're a good person. And so if you can put a problem or a psychological problem into a good person, that's a very dramatic thing to do. But in this case, it's a misrepresentation, and you can't. There shouldn't be any censorship or anything, but I think there should be this open debate and critique, and I think that's, when it came out around the Hurt Locker, I think it was really beneficial for this whole discussion.
Well, I also think another problem is, I think it's a cop-out for Catherine Bigelow and the writer to say, well, poetic license, this is a movie, because in fact, it misrepresented what it was showing. And hang on, I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm losing my train of thought, but I will go back actually to something about a film that's coming out that will be a very different view of the Second World War, which is a film called Fury, that you may have read about. It was written about in the New York Times on Sunday. Brad Pitt's in it. And it shows how, particularly towards the end of the war, but American soldiers, you're in war. People do not behave the way they do in civil society, particularly after 4 years of fighting. And I thought it was interesting that the article said that the writer-director is a man named David Ayer. Ayer wanted to jolt viewers into a fresh and fractious conversation about the movies and ground truth. when you see a lot of these films in which, like the Hurt Locker, where he's treated more like a, what do you call it, a cowboy or a hot dog. And I think it gives an impression to impressionable young men watching, thinking, hey man, this is going to be cool to go off to war. And I think it does a real disservice not to show what war is really like. I've never been in a war. I've not served in the military. But I feel that's true.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I think, and this is, I think, what Marlanus is getting at with his book, What It Is Like to Go to War, is that the old myths about sort of to pump us up and get us ready for war, they don't work anymore. And you look at something like the Deer Hunter. Before those guys deploy to Vietnam, they say, hey, they want to be in it. You know, the Green Beret comes in and he sits down at the bar and he's having a drink, and all he can say is, F it. And yet these guys really want to follow him. And you know, we do that. And I think Americans as a whole, like, we like to think of ourselves as sort of, you know, laughing in the face of danger, that we can handle it. And then you come back and it's not like that at all. And Marlanus in his book, that's what he's saying at there, that we need to find another way to say, hey, look, yeah, you know, buyer beware, don't do military service, but hey, it's not going to be a cakewalk when you come back, and you should know that before you deploy. Of course, the question is, if you did that, would recruiters make their numbers at all? But I think, you know, nobody wants to be lied to, and you want to go in with as wide open eyes as you can, probably. And Marlanus is saying that with something like PTSD. Yeah, you're going to have it. You might have it. You might have problems readjusting. But if you know that going in, that you're not going to be able to come back, you know, and pick up where you left off, it might make the adjustment that much easier when you do come back.
Do you feel that some things are just in the American culture where you prove your manhood by going to war?
Well, I don't know about that, Gene. I'm sure there's other male bonding rituals that you can. But I will say personally, for me, yes. I mean, in the sense that my dad was a veteran. He served for a couple years in the 60s. My grandfather was a career Army airborne infantry officer. So my nephew is serving in the Air Force right now in Germany. So this idea that this is something that I should do, even though it wasn't pushed on me. You know, my mother's here. She'll tell you she didn't want me to go in the military. And I don't think my father did either, because once it's your kid, it's a different thing. But just growing up around it, yeah, you know, I wanted to do it because I wanted to prove to myself that I could, and I could hang with these men that I had admired growing up. Definitely.
I want to pick up something implicit in what you were saying and pose a question about violence and its representation. I mean, obviously war is extremely violent by definition. There's a way in which violence is represented both in cinema and the culture more generally that has tended to romanticize it in some ways. At the same time, there's also you know, it's not to say that all war making today is at a distance, but elements of war making today are more distantiated from the objects of the violence by those perpetrating the violence than it once was, right? It's not all hand-to-hand, face-to-face, close-up combat, technological warfare, drone warfare, and so on. And I wonder if that shifts the way in which people relate to war, relate to the violence that they're perpetrating, and the impact that it has on those who are engaged in those forms of war making when they in fact return to civil life.
Yeah, geez, that's a good question. You know, that's something that Marlanus also talks about. Man, I'm shilling Karl Marlanus and Cal Humanities, but it is a great book because he does talk about that. He talks about this obliteration of the line between, you know, there's the battlefield and there's the civilian world, and you know, you can be physically safe, and yet, you know, you're pressing this button or you're flying this drone or something, and you know that you're going to kill people when you do that. So I can't speak to it personally, obviously, but I think it is something worth talking about with all the different media. For example, in the old days, you couldn't call home very easily from the battlefield, and when I was in Iraq, you could. not immediately, but by the time I left, there were call centers everywhere. So how do you do that, right? This line between the war space and the peace space is more and more obliterated. And I know for just personally, Mom, you can back me up on this, is I had a really hard time calling home, actually. And I stopped calling home, mostly because my father was really upset about how the war was going and certain things, and I couldn't have that conversation with him over the phone about, you know, why are all these IEDs over there? Why isn't the whole city secure? Why aren't you guys, you know? And I'm like, look, man, I'm just trying to do my job. Shut up. But obviously from him, he was a very concerned father, and he was very engaged, and he's reading all the news, and this chance to talk to me, he wants to ask me all these things that he's been thinking about from watching the news. And for me, I really just wanted to ask how the family was. You look at email. I have a lot of friends who told me they didn't email me there in Iraq because they didn't know what to talk about. Right? But I wanted to engage with them, definitely. I don't know, David, if that gets to your... Yeah.
Do either of you want to speak to this question?
Well, it's sort of from an entirely, a much less personal way, but it's around the use of military hardware. I made a film called "This Film Is Not Yet Rated" about the ratings board and you know how the Motion Picture Association of America, which is the trade organization and lobbying arm for the 6 major studios, controls the ratings board. But in the process of making that, I came across something else which was really interesting that I actually put in the film, is that they have these 6 studios have a very close relationship with the Defense Department, and the Defense Department has an arrangement where they can sort of review the scripts and actually ask for changes to be made before the Defense Department lets military hardware be used for free. Now, I think, you know, that seems very objectionable. I mean, this is hardware that's owned by the public. So why is the Defense Department having control over how, you know, the artists and filmmakers in this country, which artists can use it and which artists can't? As a result, I think you see this hardware, and oftentimes it's being used, you know, obviously if you can get an aircraft carrier or tanks, I mean, you can make a much more impressive film and get a greater box office. So what you see here is the Defense Department controlling what we're seeing in a way and not hearing other voices. And I think it's still going on. I mean, it's astonishing to me that it just somehow seems illegal, but I guess it isn't.
I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. While we're waiting for them, anything any of you want to add at this point?
No, I'm just thinking about all the films I want to recommend for people to go see.
Go ahead.
Okay. Some of them may not even deal with Americans in war. There's a marvelous French film called Grand Illusion, a pacifist film made by Jean Renoir in 1937. There's Gallipoli, an Australian film that was about the First World War. Now, you know, these aren't veterans returning, but you're seeing what's happening to these young men as soldiers. Eric Maria Remarque, All's Quiet on the Western Front. The soldiers sit around and talk, and you see how much it is affecting them. You don't have to wait until they are trying to reintegrate into society. And I just think there are a lot of really wonderful films. There's a film that nobody saw called Jackknife with Robert De Niro and Ed Harris, in which they had fought together, and Ed Harris has become an alcoholic, completely fallen apart, cannot look at his war experience and the things that happened over there, and De Niro tries to help him come to terms with it. Birdie is another film like that. But I see we have the questions now, so I'll shut up.
So there are a range of questions. I'm going to begin with one. Characterizations of veterans coming home from combat in Vietnam have changed or are different from those coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. We began to address that early on in the discussion today. How has film influenced those characterizations?
You know, I've actually wondered, which I mentioned earlier, I don't know what it is in the culture that the soldiers and veterans are not being blamed for the Iraq War the way the Vietnam veterans were. And I don't have an answer, so I'm hoping somebody else does.
Well, I think one is that the Vietnam War was such a failure, I think, in a lot of ways. As a war, I think that there was that the society didn't even want the association in a way. And I think there was I think part of it was working through the critique of that war through kind of individual stories. So I think that might be part of it.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, again, I would go back to the idea of the draft and how everybody was more invested back then and therefore complicit, whereas, for my generation and those in the 90s, Colonel Arnold Strong is here, and he and I share a favorite film, war film, Black Hawk Down, because at the end of Black Hawk Down, that speech that Eric Bana gives really summed it up for me. And I'd seen, the film before I went to war, but when I came back from it, it really made sense. You're not being drafted, you're not being asked, do I agree with this cause or not, and I'm not, and therefore complicit if I agree or I'm not. You go to war because of the people to your left and right. You go to war because you've been living with these people for a year and a half, for 2 years, these are your brothers and sisters, and therefore, whatever the political sort of associations are with it, you're not concerned with that because you're already in the military as an all-volunteer force. And that speech really summed it up for me, and I really got it when I got back. I didn't care about whether it was right or not to go to Iraq. I only cared that those people were looking at me to go and try to inspire them and bring them back with some sort of confidence.
There was a question, actually, you raised the question of the draft. There's no longer conscription in this country, and the question was about whether not having conscription has changed how we perceive of the poverty draft, or how a poverty draft might or might not operate, given that there's no conscription. Right? So,
I'm sorry, did you say poverty?
Poverty draft, yes. So the fact that poor people, by necessity, are more likely to have to sign up than those who are less poor.
Yeah, this is one of the things that, when I mentioned at the beginning that there were sort of, we have two countries here around this issue. People have experience with the military and people who don't. And I think it, goes back to this issue that, there isn't a national draft. And, you look at, for example, the Israeli army, and there's certainly, I think there's an advantage to, if not a national draft to serve in the military, to serve the country. It might be good for this country if everybody, would have to serve 1 year in some fashion to this country, whether it's in the military or somewhere else. I think that might prove some kind of bonding experience and also a shared understanding that doesn't exist now.
I'd obviously agree with that. It's funny, when I was a kid, I thought everybody should serve in the military. And I don't anymore. I don't think it is for everybody. But I do agree with you, Kirby, in the sense that, the country's more and more polarized, and things are getting more and more torn apart. Again, to get back to this idea of representation, we listen to the news that we want to listen to, that we agree with. We're not interested in being confronted. And the thing about the military or a national sort of draft is left and right. All sides would have to talk to one another. And just speaking personally as a guy from Hawaii, I'm from a very small place, my military experience was invaluable. I've got one of my best friends is from Texas, I didn't know anyone in Texas. From Philadelphia, I didn't know anything about the Northeast, and I was the best man in his wedding a couple years ago. I have friends all across the country, and by getting to talk to people, and not necessarily that we all agree, politically, but we understand each other, and there's a respect level there because we've all done something, and we're more willing to listen to one another rather than just tune each other out. There was an LA Times article today, or yesterday, about Facebook, and I think someone was writing about this, the Israel-Gaza conflict right now, and that I think the author was Jewish, but the idea was that as soon as they posted something that was against one of their Facebook friends' sort of political ideas, they were defriended because we don't want to deal with that, right? And how many of us have done that, right? I've done it a couple times, and I'm kind of sad that I have now, because you want to be engaged with things that are confronting. You should be, and that's, I think, what the humanities is all about.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I mean, this, speaking of the desire to serve, I mean, this is the thing that struck me so strongly when I went around and spoke to all these women and men for the Invisible War, is how important that was to them. I mean, the ideal was so strong, and I mean, it was stronger than certainly I don't share it at that level, and I was incredibly impressed. And the idea that that this country, and I think this divisiveness that you bring up is very important. If everybody had the experience of serving the country, it might bring us together in a way that right now we're not experiencing.
Here's a question about film scripts. Are there scripts in evidence which utilize military experience as a positive influence on a character's development? If so, is there any appetite in Hollywood to make such a movie? Would one even know?
Well, I think this does go back to, I think, what Kirby or you were saying, that it's not that all veterans are portrayed in a negative light at all, and yet those are the ones that we think about in some of the films that are made. I'm trying to think of films right now where I think there must be, but I don't know what they are, where it's become a more positive experience for them. The Messenger, perhaps, would be an example of one.
But here's a follow-up, actually, a related question. As someone involved in producing films for a major production company, I've repeatedly heard that audiences just don't want to see stories about wars and veterans. Thoughts? Do you or don't you agree? Braden, do you think veterans need to make these films? Why do or don't vets make or tell their own stories in cinema?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess Gene brought it up earlier, though. I mean, how many people would actually go and see those films if they were out there? I mean, you still have to get people to the theater. Whoever asked that question, I think is right on. How many people would actually want to go see? I mean, how many people here, just quick show of hands, have seen Restrepo, for example? Okay, that's pretty good, actually. Pretty half. Yeah.
Hey, documentary.
But I'm going to count all the empty seats as no. I mean, again, I hate to just keep beating this dead horse, but I do think that's where things are. Do we want to be confronted by things that, that don't fit already our sort of clicking reality TV based culture? Everything's so interactive now, whether it's, and the internet changed everything. I mean, you think about modernism or postmodernism, all these movements, we're definitely in something different now than we were before. Some people have called it pseudo-modernism, and the mimesis, that the ways of representing reality have changed so much to the consumer's benefit and the person interacting with the text, rather than, as I said, what the maker wanted. I wonder how many people would actually get to the theater to see those films.
I just had to actually just follow up. I mean, I'm curious if you might know how many vets are actually working in Hollywood. I mean, do you have any idea of that at all?
Has Colonel Arnold Strong there on the Veterans in Film and Television Board?
So Braden and I are friends, obviously, through an organization called Veterans in Film and Television, based here out of LA, co-founded by two staff sergeants, one Army, one Marine. One took the direction route and production route when he got out, went to USC. One took the acting route, went to UCLA. They realized, why aren't more people connecting us together in this industry? They founded that organization 3 years ago. And I was at their third meeting, and we were like about 12.5 people. And we're now 1,750 strong in both Los Angeles. We have a New York branch as well that more focuses on drama and all that. But so there is an emerging geist of veterans that are trying to get that story effectively told, but to your point earlier about that, the way veterans are portrayed, there's an organization called Got Your Six, which is trying to change that portrayal. And what they found, and I'll take a seat, but it's important, it's relevant to this, is that they surveyed across broad audiences that films typically portray veterans in one of two ways, and that is a totally broken, PTSD-laden, injured, hurt person who goes crazy, or they're a hero. And if you talk to any veteran, they typically don't think of themselves as either that way. And what they found is that audiences in both television and film respond almost exponentially better, as a 65 to 75% positive review when a veteran is portrayed as simply an asset to their community or to their society or whatever. So where they work and what Dr. Six works on is to get that portrait in film and television, such as there was a show, Friday Night Lights, where there's simply an interaction on one episode where a kid sees a guy in a uniform, and he's talking to his coach. He sees that, he says, "Is that you, coach?" He says, "Yeah, I did some time in the Army, best decision of my life." And that's it. There's never anything ever mentioned ever about it, but audiences respond exponentially to that because he's just a coach. He's not saying, "And I was a veteran, and you need to join the Army because being in the Army," he doesn't say any of that stuff. He just says, "It was the best part of my life." Anyway, and that's all it was. And so there is a lot in both Hollywood, because Hollywood realizes that they do have an exponential influence on the way people perceive things and the way people, whether it's film, television, or writing, that they perceive that veteran ideology. So there is a growing movement of veterans involved in film and industry, film and television, and
thank you for that. Relatedly, there's an interesting question here about writing. So there's increased writing, books, articles, stories, short stories, and so on, magazine articles about military experience, about war experience, and so on. And the question has to do with how that could get translated into cinematic representation, both as storytelling and as documentary, and obviously those aren't mutually exclusive. So is there hope that the increased writing is likely to translate into increased filmmaking and cinematic representation about these things?
I'm not sure. I think that there is. I mean, you think of people who have written about Vietnam, Tim O'Brien, Michael Hare, any number of people. They were not necessarily made into films. So I don't know if that would make a difference. But I do think that having somebody who's had that experience and is a writer, director, writer, producer, I mean, it's very hard to get into the film industry, number one. And then all the studios care about is the bottom line, what's going to make money. So if you can show that something's making money, it used to be that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, films could be targeted at a particular audience. If a film made $20 million, that was enough, because it was going for a particular type of audience. And today, no, they only want to make these big blockbusters for $150 or $180 million. They're going to bring in $300 million. And I think that change in how Hollywood runs is to the detriment of good films.
Maybe if the Ninja Turtles had been veterans that were mutated into turtles.
Could you? This gets a bit more specific about filmmaking itself. Could you speak to the specific skill set conducive to the arts that veterans may possess upon re-entering the civilian world?
Conducive to the arts? Was that the question?
Well, to the arts of representation and filmmaking and so on.
Well, I just in a very simple way. I mean, the training. I mean, I experienced this, and again, in making Invisible War. I mean, one of the challenges, of course, is in shooting documentaries, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of time, so you want your subject to show up on time. Every single veteran in Invisible War, and we interviewed hundreds, was there early. I mean, I was always shocked, you know. And filmmaking is, I mean, there is a real, you know, there's a similarity in some ways. You know, there's a real teamwork quality, and if everybody isn't working as a team, a film won't work. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is that teamwork training.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is, and if you've been on a film set, you know this, if you don't have anything to do, it's the most boring place in the world to be. And there's a lot of hurry up and wait. And you're hurrying up and wait and wait and wait and wait, and then all of a sudden there's a burst of action, and then nothing for a long time, right? And that's a little bit how the military was. But I mean, and that's tongue in cheek. I mean, there's so many great things about having served in the military. I would say two. You know, for one, just the many people that you meet across all walks of life, across all strata of income. You learn to talk to different people, and that's an invaluable skill going forward. And the second thing. I would say, you know, the discipline. I mean, I think you're getting to that, but you know, everyone that I know who's served is very professional, knows how to get the job done, and that's a great thing.
As mentioned earlier in this, as mentioned earlier in this discussion, there's been a lack of portraying how soldiers adjust to home life on the silk screen. On the silver screen, silk screen too. Right? If you had your say, what are some key points you would like to see addressed in film to display the reality of a soldier's past-war life? What is a key message you want movies or moviegoers to understand about such an experience?
I would say that we think about it every day, and I don't want to be too melodramatic about it, but I think any of us who went through that, we're still, not that we're necessarily reliving it and having these bad dreams about it, but we do think about it every day. Those of us who might seem, you know, well-adjusted, we're asking ourselves, why are we well-adjusted, and some of our brothers and sisters who served are not. We're asking those questions. We're asking, why are we intact with 2 legs and 2 arms, and some people that we served with are not. Everyone that I know who served in the military with me asks himself that question every single day, and I think that's the sort of thing I'd like to get. And the positive from that is it made me very much more appreciative of the things that I do have. You know, I try to fall in love with beautiful things in the world again. I looked at poetry, I looked at you know, filmmaking, obviously, painting, and you do value every day. And I think that's true of anyone who's gone through some sort of a near-death experience or something like that makes you confront your mortality. You are, you know, grateful for every day that you have, and you wonder why you made it back and others didn't, and you kind of hopefully, you know, you want your life to be a tribute to that and to remember those people.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just extending on what you're saying, I mean, there's oftentimes films are so shallow, but that, you know, very profound experience that you're talking about. I mean, I think this country would be a much richer country if this experience that veterans are experiencing, so many veterans are experiencing. I mean, the writers and they'd become writers and directors and explore that in films. I mean, and maybe they will with your organization and everything. But I think I think there is a lack here about that kind of profound understanding of issues of life and death.
You want to introduce me to some producers, Kirby?
Be happy to.
There's an interesting question directed at you, and that is, how does Indian cinema portray war, if at all?
Oh, well. It's a big musical production. and you know, again, tongue-in-cheek, but the thing about Indian cinema and just Indian culture in general that I experienced over there, because I didn't understand Bollywood when I first got there, and I thought it was a little silly, and I was definitely being, you know, ethnocentric. But what you realize is, the longer you're there, that music tradition comes out of every single state there in India. Every single state has its own very proud musical tradition going back for thousands of years, and that musical tradition creates the space to talk about difficult things that you don't normally talk about in polite society. You think about some of the musicals from the 40s and 50s where there could be a little more sexual innuendo or double entendres in ways that you wouldn't necessarily see in the dialogue. Well, that's very true in India. So I was being a little tongue-in-cheek there, but you know, as far as the way that the war is portrayed, I mean, seriously and stuff, you have to have music and song and dance in an Indian film, and there are ways to do it that make it interesting and not silly.
There was a curious question about why the military keeps on showing the Battle of Algiers, and I wondered whether that's in fact true. The Battle of Algiers, besides being a really interesting film, why in particular?
Because of the
Well, yeah, right, exactly.
as a training film for counterinsurgency.
Yeah, I would say the same thing.
There's a question directed at Kirby, which is, did your film achieve what it's, The Invisible War, I take it, achieve what you set out to achieve by documenting the set of experiences?
And quickly, did you know what you were looking for when did the story kind of reveal itself to you as you were, going through the whole process?
Well, I was astonished at hearing the same stories over and over and over. That it was the experience and of this not only the assault but the way that the institution responded and shutting it down. It was so ubiquitous. And by the way, I just want to say this is not just the military. I'm currently making a film on sexual assault on college campuses, and the similarities are so striking. It's when an institution, when there's not oversight, any powerful institution will, you will see this happening. But I think when we were making the film, there was so little that was being written about this, and there had been a certain amount of activism, but it was just getting slapped down. And we were really trying to make a film that. One of the things we were really trying to do, and this came out of actually the experience of talking to the veterans, is the love of the veterans for the Army and for their military experience was so profound, is that's reflected in the film. And so the film is as strong a critique of the military as it is in many ways a pro-military film, because every one of the subjects speaks so fondly of their experience. And so but we were expecting that the Defense Department would respond the way they'd always had to these. Sometimes there were scandals, sometimes exposés, and just trying to cover it up as much as possible. And that didn't happen. I think it certainly greatly increased awareness, and it led to a great number of reforms. Senator Gillibrand and others in Congress took up the cause, and I think there were like 30 reforms that were passed. There's still more to do, more important ones to do. But to answer the question, we thought it would be very explosive, but we didn't think it would cause the change it did. And I think it was because so many people within the military did not see it as an attack on their service. And I think this is one of the things, I think documentary filmmakers are, very important, but oftentimes there's a tendency to critique from the left and speak to the left, and even there are filmmakers from the right who are doing the same, and it actually helps box office. You actually probably make more money that way, but I don't think you help change policy. And I think if you can make a film where both sides can see, even if they don't necessarily agree, they can understand where you're coming from in the argument. Again, this goes back to this divisiveness that you brought up.
It also speaks to the qualities in making art or making films that one can draw on sensitivity, nuance, comprehension, understanding in relation to complex subject matters that aren't flattened out by a one-sided sort of in-your-face kind of representation.
And Kirby, I have a question for you. Do you think it was the public response, reviews that were written about it? What made it all of a sudden sort of a cause célèbre that people were willing to look at the issue? And that the military did. The military, to me, was probably responding to an outcry. But was that from people who saw it? Was that from members of Congress and the Senate?
Well, I'd actually give the military a fair amount of credit here. They started even before the film was actually theatrically released. It premiered at Sundance, and 5 months later it was released. They were starting to buy it to show many of the branches, and over time, we estimated 10 to 20% of the military had seen the film, of service members had seen the film, and that was their doing, and certainly Secretary Panetta stepped up very early on. That was only 2-3 months after the film had played at Sundance, and I don't think it had played a couple of other festivals. So, I think there was just an awareness that this was really something that was really hurting military readiness. You see the same thing in colleges. The people that were getting assaulted often were the most idealistic, best soldiers. These are the people that you want in your military, and they were getting forced out. And so I think there was a realization that this would actually, addressing this issue would actually make the military stronger.
I think that's how I saw your film, Kirby, as a readiness issue. The term is fragging, right? You frag an officer or someone. It's when your own soldiers kill you. Friendly fire could be another way to look at it. But that's how I looked at these sexual assaults. This is fragging. This is friendly fire. This is, I'm a man down or a woman down now because there's a soldier that's on my MTO, my table of organization equipment, that's taking up a spot in my platoon or in my company, and yet they're helpless. They can't work. They can't deploy. Because they've been destroyed by this sexual assault, and that's a terrible thing for readiness, certainly.
So we've reached the close. I want to give each of you the opportunity to have one last brief word, if you would like, regarding the nature of both making art. There was a question about the impact, and you raised it in your final comments, about the impact of art making and policy making. And one could say that for the most part, art making does not set out to change policy necessarily. It might set out to change the way we think about things, which might change policy. But just to have you reflect a bit on the art of filmmaking, the art of cinematic representation, and the impact on in a broader social way.
Sure. Well, so I'll go back to the same drum I've been beating for most of this time, is this idea of where the culture is as far as the representation on film. And I think this docudrama style is really great in some ways and really dangerous in other ways, because I think when I referenced The Hurt Locker and what Anne Hornaday was talking about, this emotional truth and the payoff of when the veteran, when Jeremy Renner's character comes back, and whether you like the film or you didn't like the film, everybody loves that scene when he's in the supermarket and he can't adjust. I think all of us love that scene. The question is, how did we get there, right? And if you talk about emotional truth, that's fine, but then that's not a very far step to truthiness, right? Whose truth is it, right? And if that is the portrayal that the artist is set out to make, and yet the people who actually served in that are saying, hey, this isn't right at all, there's a real disconnect right there. And I think that's something very dangerous for filmmakers and that should be considered. And I think as a culture, you look at The Hurt Locker, I said 97% Rotten Tomatoes, and yet you've got this whole Wikipedia entry, hey, there's a problem here. That's the thing that I'm most concerned about with our culture, the interactiveness, and as I said, the fetishizing of the recipient, and that it's more important that my experience watching the film my experience watching the film is more important than maybe what the maker set out to sort of what issues the maker set out to try to raise.
Well, I think that in a lot of cases it's hard to divorce politics from some films. There are a lot of films that are made by people who are anti a particular war, for instance. That doesn't necessarily extend to their treatment of the veterans. I think that, for me at least, when I think of the war films that mean so much to me that I can see over and over again, like Bridge on the River Kwai. I think those films affect people and teach people things that if you have not served in the military, if you have not been in a war, that's what brings it home. I think a constant throughout last century in terms of the wars and the films is, again, that sense of horrible isolation that the returning veteran has, and the fact that the public at large is completely not unprepared for it. They don't even think about it. The war is over. You're just supposed to move on. But how do you just move on when one day you're, killing people or trying to save your own, protect yourself, and the next day all of a sudden you're back with all these other people who have no idea what you went through? And I think it's important to try and find a way to reach the public and have them experience some of what the soldiers have gone through to better understand them and to make their transition back into civilian life easier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm actually kind of curious what the effect of, right now, obviously, there's been so much focus in society about the returning veteran, but I'm interested in what the veteran will bring to this society over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. You certainly look at, with World War II, how much that experience, I think, created so many positive things about this country. And especially, I would be hopeful, and I'm so happy to hear about your organization, that would affect Hollywood and film and television, because, issues of war are so profound to this country in particular. Particularly, you look at the Vietnam War and the effect that it had on our country, and the Iraq War, and I think I would really hope, and maybe there's, I'm slightly positive that veterans would move into the film and television, because I think we really won't get, that sort of profound understanding without veterans making these films and being in the, writing, directing, producing, acting roles on these films.
So thank you. Felicia Kelly will offer some closing remarks.
This program was one of 5 public conversations exploring different facets of the veteran experience conducted during the summer of 2014 as part of War Comes Home, a Cal Humanities statewide initiative to open minds to the critical issues veterans face when coming home from war. How should communities welcome service members back? How can we build bridges of understanding between those who have served and those who have not? For more information, visit www.calhum.org. Public Conversations is a project of Cal Humanities in partnership with the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the California State Library, and California Public Libraries. It is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bay Tree Fund, the Whitman Institute, and the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act, administered in California by the State Librarian. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording do not necessarily represent those of Cal Humanities, the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the California State Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bay Tree Fund, or the Whitman Institute.